Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're immersing ourselves in something pretty shadowy, really. Russian hybrid warfare, or what many call the gray zone.
That's right. We're looking at how Russia uses tactics that are, well, non-military, or at least below that clear threshold of armed conflict to get what it wants strategically.
Exactly. Without needing to fire a major conventional shot, so to speak. But here's the hook. The really surprising thing we found digging through the research for this deep dive.
Go on.
It seems the West might actually be winning this fight in the gray zone.
Winning? How so? That feels counterintuitive.
Well, that's the thing. They might be winning, but haven't fully grasped it yet, or maybe haven't adapted their thinking to recognize this quiet kind of victory. That's really our mission today.
Okay, so we need to unpack that. If the West is winning, it's probably not through traditional military dominance in this space. It's likely more about resilience, right? Strategies built from the society up.
Precisely. So our goal today is to give you the full picture. First, we'll dig into why Russia feels the need for these asymmetric tactics.
Looking at their strategic calculus, yeah.
Then we'll analyze the actual threats they deploy. We're talking everything from, weaponized migration, which sounds dramatic but is very real, to things like institutional espionage.
And critically, we need to cover the other side of the coin, the defense.
Absolutely. We'll spend a good chunk of time on these complex, whole-of-society defense strategies. Total defense, they often call it. We see this particularly in the Baltics and the Nordic countries.
Right. Countries on the front line, essentially.
We've pulled from a lot of material here. Major defense studies, policy analysis on international law, even real-time reports on recent NATO security incidents. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding a conflict that's always simmering, but rarely boils over into the headlines until it does.
Okay, so before we jump in deep, let's get that definition clear. Because gray zone or hybrid warfare, it's not just, random mischief or dirty tricks. It's specific.
It is. It's the coordinated use of different tools, political pressure, economic levers, information ops, covert actions, sometimes even overt small-scale kinetic stuff.
But always, crucially, staying below that internationally recognized threshold of armed conflict.
And the key ingredient, the thing that makes it work, according to sources, ambiguity.
Yes, massive ambiguity. These actions are designed deliberately to make it fuzzy. Who's really behind it? What are their actual goals? Does this count as an act of war, or is it something else?
Right. It throws the target nation off balance. Are we dealing with a crime, a migration surge?
Espionage.
Or is this the prelude to something bigger? You just don't know for sure.
And that hesitation, that uncertainty, that is the strategic goal of the ambiguity itself. It paralyzes the response.
So we need to be careful, too, to distinguish. There's this sort of everyday gray zone noise, like state-sponsored media broadcasts.
Like RT, yeah. Standard propaganda, you could say.
And then there are these focused, aggressive operations. Orchestrating a border crisis, systematically buying up land near critical infrastructure. That's different. That's aggressive balancing.
And understanding why they engage in that aggressive balancing, that takes us right back to Russia's strategic thinking. Okay, so to really get why Russia leans so heavily on these, let's call them cheaper, more deniable tactics, you have to understand their deep-seated sense of vulnerability. It's historical.
Rooted in geography, right?
Absolutely. Look at a map. Russia sits on this vast, largely featureless European plain. Historically, that meant invasion routes were wide open from multiple directions.
Which forced them, for centuries really, to constantly seek strategic depth, pushing their borders outwards.
Exactly. And that historical insecurity, that drive for depth, it feeds directly into their current geopolitical goals. Analysts often talk about them wanting a kind of Yalta 2.0.
A new great power settlement, essentially. And they see three main strategic ends they need to achieve, non-negotiable ones.
The first is absolutely fundamental for them. Establishing what they see as an uncontested, privileged sphere of influence right across the territory of the former USSR.
So not just influencing these countries, but having a kind of veto power over their major choices.
Pretty much. Ensuring Russian influence is supreme there, and crucially, keeping other major powers, especially the US and NATO, out, denying them strategic entry.
Okay, that's goal one. What's the second?
The second is about global clout. Securing a decisive seat at the big table, the great powers table, particularly in regions where the rules are maybe still being written or things are in flux.
Like the Arctic, maybe? Or parts of the Middle East, Africa?
Precisely. They want to be seen as indispensable players, even if sometimes that role involves, destabilizing things.
And the third goal?
It's broader. Containment. basically constraining the United States' ability to act unilaterally around the world, particularly where U.S. interests clash with what Russia sees as its own historical or strategic concerns.
Okay, so those are some pretty ambitious goals. Pursuing them needs real power. The most direct way is what international relations folks call hard balancing.
Right. Build up your military, form powerful alliances, standard stuff.
But here's the kicker, the big constraint that really forces their hand towards the gray zone.
They just can't afford it.
Simple as that.
Fundamentally, yes. Russia is, relatively speaking, a second-tier global power trying to balance against the world's undisputed leader, the U.S. The military spending numbers tell the story.
I saw that data. The U.S. accounts for something like 36% of global military spending.
Around that, yeah. And Russia. They're struggling to stay above 3%, maybe 3.4%, trying to compete conventionally against the combined weight of NATO, led by the U.S. It's just economically ruinous for them.
So hard balancing is off the table. It's too expensive. That means their grand strategy had to evolve, right? It had to shift.
Exactly. It shifted away from trying to accommodate the West towards this asymmetric approach. The sources we looked at trace this evolution pretty clearly through 3 phases since about 2000.
Okay, walk us through those. Phase I.
Phase I was what they call pragmatic accommodation. Roughly 2000 to 2003, Russia was still pretty weak after the 90s. They played that weak hand, basically hoping to get concessions from the West by offering cooperation on certain things.
Like after 9/11. I remember they offered support for the war on terror.
They did. Tacit support, allowing U.S. basing in Central Asia for Afghanistan operations, things like that. The calculation was, if we help them, maybe they'll give us guarantees on NATO expansion, maybe cut us some slack on arms control.
But it didn't work out that way.
No, those concessions just didn't come. In 2002, the U.S. pulled out of the ABM treaty. And then, the real blow from Moscow's perspective, NATO invited the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, to start accession talks.
Right into their perceived backyard.
Exactly. So Russia learned, okay, cooperation isn't securing our core strategic need, which is control over our immediate neighborhood.
Which leads to Phase 2.
Phase 2, soft balancing, runs roughly from 2003 to 2007. Having learned that cooperation failed, Russia started using non-military tools more actively, trying to delay or just raise the political cost of U.S. power projection.
How? Like using their veto in the UN Security Council?
Yeah.
Economic pressure?
Things like that, yes. Weaponizing international institutions' economic statecraft. Not trying to defeat U.S. power, but to frustrate it, make it more difficult. And this is also when you start hearing much tougher rhetoric from Moscow about the unipolar world being dangerous, trying to rally others against U.S. dominance, but still stopping short of military confrontation.
Okay, so accommodation failed, soft balancing wasn't enough. Which brings us to now.
Right. Phase 3, asymmetric balancing. This really starts crystallizing around 2007, maybe developing concretely for a few years, and then becomes much more overt and aggressive after 2014 with the invasion of Crimea and the Donbass.
And this is where the gray zone tactics become the primary tool.
It's a strategy born of necessity. Because conventional military competition is just too expensive, they rely on these covert, ambiguous, deniable, and crucially cost-effective methods to pursue those same long-standing geopolitical goals. It's not some brilliant new doctrine they dreamed up. It's the path they were almost forced onto by economic reality.
Okay, so that connects the strategic why to the practical how. If the goal is cost-effective disruption, how do they actually do it? Where do they target?
Well, they target the strengths and perhaps the perceived weaknesses of their adversaries.
And this is where the gray zone really finds fertile ground, isn't it? Because liberal democracies, well, they're built on openness, human rights, rule of law.
Exactly. And Russia's become very adept at exploiting those very values, weaponizing them, essentially, to sow fear, create division, and ultimately weaken the political will in Western countries, maybe eroding support for allies like Ukraine, for instance.
And one of the starkest examples of this, something the sources really focus on, is the instrumentalization of migration.
Yes, this is one of the hardest gray zone challenges to counter effectively, because it puts the target country in an impossible bind.
How so?
Well, you can't really respond symmetrically, can you? You can't meet migrants at the border with tanks. But if you try to respond strictly within the bounds of international human rights law, the aggressor can simply keep funneling people across, overwhelming your systems and paralyzing your border control.
There was that early, almost bizarre test case, wasn't there, back in 2015, 2016, on the Finnish and Norwegian borders with Russia.
The bicycles. Yes. It sounds absurd, but it was highly calculated. Russia started directing refugees, mostly from the Middle East and North Africa, towards these very remote Arctic border crossings.
And specifically made them use vehicles. Why?
It was a loophole exploitation. Russian law apparently prohibited pedestrians from crossing at those specific vehicle checkpoints. But Norway, under international law, had to accept asylum applications made at an official crossing point. So forcing them onto bicycles fulfilled the letter of both laws while creating maximum difficulty for Norway.
Having to process hundreds of asylum seekers on bikes in the Arctic in winter.
Exactly. Huge cost, huge logistical nightmare. And it was clearly designed to test Finland's and Norway's legal limits and operational capacity while generating political friction.
What's really crucial to grasp, the sources emphasize, is how an orchestrated crisis like this forces the target country to fight on multiple fronts at once. 4 conflicting dimensions they identified.
Right. First, there's the obvious national security dimension. You have to remember the Russian Border Guard Service is part of the FSB, their main security agency. So there's always the risk, however small, of infiltration. Could agents, maybe even sabotage teams, be hidden among genuine asylum seekers?
The little green men worry.
That's part of it, but also just the sheer pressure of numbers. The goal is often simply to overwhelm local authorities, tie up resources, force the government to spend massively on processing, housing, potentially deporting people money that could otherwise go to defense or other priorities.
Okay, so security is one dimension. What's the second conflict?
The conflict with international law and the rules-based order. This is where it gets really tough for democracies. To regain immediate control, countries like Finland or Poland feel forced to consider things like mass pushbacks, physically preventing people from crossing or immediately returning them without process.
But that directly clashes with the right to seek asylum, right?
Yeah.
International conventions say you have to assess claims individually.
Exactly. So you get situations like Finland spending months debating new domestic laws to try and legalize pushbacks, essentially putting its own national security needs against its international legal obligations. And Russia wants this. They want to force Western countries into violating their own stated values.
Which leads straight into the third dimension.
The information dimension. Any internal debate, any controversy over these border practices, whether it's Finland's pushback law or Poland building a fence, or just images of migrants suffering in makeshift camps, it all becomes ammunition for the aggressor.
Russian-backed media, disinformation campaigns jump all over it.
Immediately. They amplify the divisions, spread narratives about Western hypocrisy, cruelty, or incompetence. The goal is to trigger political instability inside the target country, fracture public support for the government, maybe even weaken alliances.
And the final dimension sounds the most difficult, emotionally.
It is. The moral dimension. When these border situations lead to visible human suffering, people getting injured, freezing, even dying, public opinion hits a crisis point. Even if people intellectually know that Russia or Belarus manufactured the crisis, the raw images of suffering make them question whether their government's security-first response is morally justifiable.
So Russia aims to weaponize empathy, essentially, to make citizens doubt their own government's choices.
Precisely. Stress the inhumanity, undermine the government's moral authority, make people question if security is worth sacrificing core values. It's a four-way trap designed to paralyze and divide.
Beyond weaponizing people, they've also exploited legal and institutional gaps, haven't they? Like with property purchases.
Yes, that's another classic tactic highlighted in the sources. Strategic property purchases. This is a big issue in Finland, particularly.
Because of their long border and proximity.
Exactly. Russian nationals, often individuals suspected of acting as proxies for state interests, were systematically buying up land and properties. And often, these properties were suspiciously located near strategic sites, military bases, key communication masts, vital supply routes.
And the justification was often something vague, like tourism.
Usually, yeah, we're building a resort, it's a holiday development, but then quite often nothing much would happen after the sale. The development would just stall.
The most prominent case was that company, Helmi, in the Finnish archipelago.
That's the one. A really textbook example. Over several years, they bought up numerous islands and coastal properties, many of them right along critical shipping lanes in the Baltic Sea.
And the infrastructure they built wasn't exactly typical for a tourist venture.
Not at all. They put in a serious helicopter landing pad, extensive docks, capable of handling decent-sized vessels. And maybe the weirdest part, they bought several decommissioned Finnish Navy vessels and just left them there, apparently without even repainting them.
So the worry wasn't holiday homes, it was something else entirely.
The concern was surveillance intelligence gathering, maybe even setting up potential command posts or sabotage bases. Remember, something like 90% of Finland's imports and exports go through the Baltic Sea. It's their economic lifeline. The fear was that Helmi was creating the capacity to monitor, disrupt, or even blockade these vital sea lines in a crisis.
And Finland found it hard to react legally.
Very hard initially because, property rights are protected. It actually took them until 2020 to bring back stricter legislation. Now, third country nationals need explicit permission from the Ministry of Defense to buy property near strategic locations.
What about the properties already bought?
That's still a challenge. Dealing with those existing strategically placed assets is legally complex. It requires ongoing intelligence work, sometimes even legal battles or expropriation. It shows how exploiting these seemingly mundane legal systems can create long-term security headaches.
Though Finland did find a creative way to hit back recently, didn't they? With confiscating properties.
They did, yes. In October 2024, they managed to seize about 40 Russian-owned properties, worth quite a lot, maybe 4 billion euros. But interestingly, the legal basis wasn't national security.
What was it then?
It was to satisfy a huge compensation claim that Ukraine's state energy company, Naftogaz, had won against Russia in international arbitration. So Finland used international commercial law enforcement as a tool to impose a cost on Russia for assets located on Finnish soil. Quite clever, using one legal system to counter exploitation in another.
Okay, so property is one area. Another institution they've apparently leveraged is the Russian Orthodox Church, ROC.
Yes, this is a particularly sensitive one, obviously weaponizing faith. The ROC has long been a tool of Russian soft power and state propaganda abroad. But the sources suggest it's also been used pretty systematically for intelligence gathering and influence operations, especially in the Nordic countries.
Where specifically? Are there examples?
There are. In Sweden, for instance, concerns were raised about a church linked to the Moscow Patriarchate being established in Västerås. Its location was interesting, very close to a major Westinghouse nuclear fuel plant and also near a significant airport.
Coincidence.
Maybe. But then another ROC-linked church was set up right beside the Marma military shooting range, which is also near critical infrastructure like power plants and key bridges.
So the church provides a plausible cover for meetings, maybe for personnel.
Plausible cover, a potential source of information from the local community, a network to potentially influence. Similar concerns popped up in Norway. There was an attempt to build a church very near Håkonsvern, which is Norway's main naval base, and they did successfully establish one near the Vardø radar complex in northern Norway, a key NATO intelligence site.
Has there been any pushback against this?
Yes, significantly in Sweden. In 2024, the Swedish government actually cut off state funding support for the ROC within Sweden.
On what grounds?
Because investigations had established clear links between some ROC leadership in Sweden, Russian intelligence services, and even funding traced back to Rosatom, the Russian state nuclear energy company. So Sweden used financial and legal levers, not military ones, to counter what it saw as institutional exploitation by a foreign state.
So migration, property, the church.
Yeah.
It's a multi-pronged approach, clearly designed to chip away, to destabilize from within.
Exactly. It's diversified aggression, and that necessitates an equally diversified defense strategy. Which brings us neatly to this concept of total defense.
Right. If the aggression targets the whole of society, then the defense has to involve the whole of society too. And that's what these Nordic and Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden, Finland, have really embraced with total defense, or TDUW.
Yeah, total defense and unconventional warfare capabilities integrated together. It's not just about buying more tanks or planes. It's a fundamental mindset shift, a commitment across the entire society.
What's the core idea behind it? Deterrence.
Primarily, yes, but specifically deterrence by denial. Rather than relying only on massive conventional forces, which might actually seem provocative to Russia, potentially inviting a preemptive strike. TDUW focuses on making the country resilient, making it functionally ungovernable, unusable for an invader.
So raising the cost of aggression, making an invasion look like just too much trouble, not worth the potential gains.
Exactly. Make the cost-benefit analysis for Moscow tilt heavily towards don't bother.
And it's not just military readiness, is it? It's broader.
Much broader. It integrates the military, yes, but also involves securing government functions, protecting critical infrastructure, bolstering psychological defense against disinformation, strengthening internal security forces, and maybe most distinctively really deep civil preparedness. Training ordinary citizens how to resist, how to survive, how to contribute during a conflict or even an occupation.
So it's about fighting during an invasion, but also after, if occupation happens.
That's a key part of the strategy, especially for the Baltic states. The idea is to be able to sustain resistance even under occupation, to delay the enemy, disrupt their control, deny them the use of captured infrastructure, power grids, transport networks, communications, essentially make the occupation as painful and unproductive for them as possible, while buying precious time for allies like NATO to potentially intervene.
Let's look at the Baltic specifically, since they're right there on the front line. Their TDUW approaches must be pretty advanced. Estonia often comes up as a leader here.
It really is considered the gold standard in many ways. Estonia's defense plans deeply integrate their voluntary defense organization, the Kaitseväe or Defense League.
That's the volunteer force,
Right.
like a National Guard, but maybe more deeply embedded.
Sort of. It's a militarily structured force subordinate to the regular defense forces, but it's made up of volunteers from all walks of life, farmers, teachers, IT specialists, you name it. And their roles are diverse. Territorial defense, protecting strategic sites, but also, crucially for Estonia, very advanced cyber defense.
How big is it?
Currently around 16,000 members, but they had ambitious plans to grow it towards 30,000. But honestly, the most impressive number isn't the size of the force, it's the public will.
What do you mean?
Government surveys in Estonia consistently show incredibly high public willingness to participate in defense. Something like 54%, over half of all citizens, say they'd be willing to personally take part in defense activities if Estonia were attacked.
Wow. And does that include the Russian-speaking minority too? Because that's often seen as a potential wedge issue.
Yes, and that's the really striking part. That high percentage includes a significant portion of the Russophone population. They express a strong commitment to defending Estonia.
That must be a huge blow to the standard Russian hybrid playbook, which often relies on trying to incite ethnic divisions.
It absolutely is. It shows a level of societal cohesion and national commitment that seriously complicates any Russian plans based on creating a fifth column or exploiting internal fault lines during a crisis. It's a major strategic asset for Estonia.
Okay, moving south, what about Latvia?
Latvia had to make some pretty deep cuts to its defense, including its National Guard, the Zemesards, after the 2008 financial crisis. But they're actively rebuilding now. The goal is to get the Zemesards up to about 12,000 trained personnel by 2027.
What's their specific focus within TDUW?
Latvia puts a strong emphasis on whole-of-society readiness exercises, getting government agencies, businesses, and the public involved, and also on developing really robust psychological operations capabilities, specifically to counter the pervasive Russian information campaigns targeting the country.
And then Lithuania. Their geography gives them a unique worry, doesn't it? The Suwalki Gap.
Absolutely. The nightmare scenario for Lithuania, and for NATO really, is that narrow land corridor between Belarus and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad being snapped shut, cutting off the Baltic states by land. So Lithuania's planning is heavily influenced by that threat.
How does that translate into their TDUW approach? Heavy focus on civil defense.
Very much so. Lithuania has been quite proactive in issuing detailed public manuals. Probably the most famous is the Guide to Active Resistance, distributed directly to citizens.
What's in these guides? General survival tips.
Much more than that. They're surprisingly sophisticated. They outline specific tactics for both non-violent and, let's say, low-end violent resistance that ordinary people could employ, even if the formal military command structure gets disrupted or overwhelmed.
It's like what kind of tactic?
Things like how to organize local labor strikes to gum up occupation logistics, how to set up strategic roadblocks using civilian vehicles, trucks, tractors, how to organize community networks to safely gather and disseminate intelligence or counter-propaganda. The idea is to make the country an administrative, political, and economic quagmire for any occupying force.
And they also have a volunteer force.
Yes, the Lithuanian Riflemen's Union, it's got about 11,000 members, works closely with the National Guard, and focuses heavily on territorial defense training within local communities.
Okay, so this whole of society thing isn't just rhetoric. There are concrete structures and plans. Rand Corporation actually studied resistance scenarios, didn't they? They defined different types of resistance units.
They did. It helps illustrate how this multi-layered whole-of-society approach might actually function in a conflict. They identified 4 main types of resistance units, ranging from highly trained professionals down to ordinary civilians.
What's the top tier?
Your high-end violent action squads. These would be your special operations forces, maybe elite National Guard units. Their job is complex kinetic stuff. Ambushing enemy armor, raiding command posts, high-value target interdiction requires serious training, heavy weapons.
Okay, below that.
You have low-end violent action squads. Think more along the lines of police volunteers, members of those riflemen's unions or defense leagues. They'd handle less complex, more localized kinetic actions, ambushing supply trucks, maybe some sabotage of non-critical infrastructure, protecting local leaders or resistance figures.
Then the focus shifts away from direct fighting.
Right. The third type is unconventional warfare support cells. These are crucial. They're likely local groups, maybe organized around a neighborhood, a workplace, a social club. Their mission is entirely supported. Gathering intelligence on enemy movements, securing and distributing supplies, providing safe houses, running communications, basic medical aid. They're the logistical backbone and the eyes and ears of the resistance.
And the fourth type, purely civilian.
Exactly, nonviolent action cells. This is where you see mass citizen participation through organized civil disobedience and information operations. Think about coordinated actions like using street theater or graffiti to mock occupiers and undermine their authority. Mobilizing truckers or farmers to block key roads at critical moments, setting up underground printing presses or social media networks to distribute truthful information and counter enemy propaganda, or importantly, documenting war crimes.
So it's the synergy between all four types, the kinetic punch, the logistical support, and the mass nonviolent resistance that creates that deterrence by denial.
That's the concept. Make occupation impossible to sustain. And interestingly, the RAND analysis also looked at what technologies were considered essential across almost all these different types of units and phases of conflict, even deep into an occupation scenario.
And it wasn't necessarily fighter jets or tanks, I assume?
Not primarily for the resistance elements, no. The things that came up again and again as critical were, first, robust, secure mobile communications, absolutely vital. Second, good quality night vision devices. Third, mobile computing tablets, rugged laptops. Fourth, still and video cameras for documenting everything, for intel, for information ops. Fifth, basic all-terrain mobility, think of motorcycles, ATVs, maybe just sturdy civilian 4x4s. And sixth, basic small arms for personal defense and those low-end kinetic actions.
It really highlights how critical information, communication, and basic mobility are in modern resistance, doesn't it? Maybe even more than heavy firepower for these kinds of units.
Okay, so total defense is the deep strategic resilience piece. But on the front lines, especially in the air, you need that immediate sovereign response capability. That's where Quick Reaction Alert, QRA, comes in.
Or Airspace Control Alert, as it's known in the U.S. Basically, fighters ready to scramble 24/7.
Exactly. NATO air forces maintain the state of readiness across Europe. But the Baltic states, they don't have their own advanced fighter jets capable of this mission.
So they rely entirely on NATO partners rotating forces through the Baltic air policing mission.
That's right. Allies send detachments of fighters on a rotational basis to bases in Estonia and Lithuania, specifically to provide that QRA capability for the whole region.
And those QRA forces have certainly been busy lately. There was that incident in September 2025. Pretty bold move by Russia.
Very bold. 3 Russian MiG-31 fighter jets deliberately flew into Estonian airspace.
And it wasn't just a quick slip across the line, was it?
No, not at all. Reports said they went about 5 nautical miles deep and stayed inside sovereign Estonian airspace for a full 12 minutes. That's not an accident, that's a deliberate provocation.
How's the response handled?
Textbook QRA. 2 Italian F-35s, which were stationed at Ämari Air Base in Estonia as part of the NATO mission Baltic Eagle 3rd, it was called, scrambled immediately. They intercepted the MiGs and escorted them back out into international airspace. Mission accomplished, message sent.
And just a few days before that, Poland had a different kind of air intrusion, right? Drones.
Yes, less conventional, but maybe equally concerning in some ways. Poland reported 19 separate instances of drone-like objects entering its airspace over just 2 days, September 9th and 10th.
19. That's a swarm. Did they react?
They did. NATO jets were involved in the response, and reports indicate they shot down at least 3, maybe 4 of these unmanned objects. Still unclear exactly what they were or who was controlling them, but the timing and location point fingers, obviously.
These kinds of deliberate violations, especially the manned aircraft one over Estonia, they inevitably spark that political debate, don't they? About the rules of engagement, ROE.
Oh, absolutely. Immediately after the Estonian incident, you had prominent figures. Czech President Petr Pavel, former U.S. President Trump, was quoted as well, publicly calling for a tougher line. Basically saying NATO should just shoot down any manned Russian aircraft that violates NATO airspace, period.
But that's not the current NATO policy, is it? The institutional approach seems much more cautious.
Much more cautious. The actual ROE for the Baltic air policing mission are classified, of course, but everything indicates they're very carefully calibrated to avoid accidental or unwanted escalation. There's a world of difference, politically and militarily, between shooting down a small unmanned drone, which happens relatively often now without major incident, and shooting down a manned fighter jet with Russian pilots on board.
That takes us straight to the Turkey precedent from 2015, doesn't it? A real-world example of what happens when a NATO member does shoot down a Russian jet.
Exactly. Turkey had been complaining about repeated Russian violations of its airspace near the Syrian border. They got frustrated, drew a line, and when a Russian Su-24 crossed it again, they shot it down.
And militarily, from Turkey's perspective, it worked.
In a narrow sense, yes. Reports indicate Russia basically stopped violating Turkish airspace after that incident. Deterrence achieved, you could argue.
But the political fallout was huge.
Immediate and severe. Turkey faced a barrage of international criticism, including from some within NATO itself, accusing them of recklessness, of escalating tensions towards a potential wider conflict. Even WWIAI was thrown around.
And didn't some allies actually pull military assets out of Turkey in response?
They did. Critically, several allies withdrew their Patriot missile defense batteries that had been deployed to protect Turkey. That sent a very clear signal of disapproval and lack of unified alliance backing for Turkey's unilateral action. Plus, the incident fueled anti-Western sentiment among parts of the Turkish public.
The lesson learned.
The lesson, which resonates across NATO capitals today, is that while a decisive military response can deter further immediate aggression, the political costs, both internationally and potentially in terms of alliance cohesion, can be incredibly high. It acts as a powerful cautionary tale, explaining why there's such reluctance now to adopt a shoot-down on-site policy for manned aircraft incursions, despite the provocations.
Okay, if we're talking about the gray zone being defined by ambiguity and deniability, then for years the Wagner Group was really the poster child for this, wasn't it?
Absolutely, the quintessential gray zone tool. Russia used this so-called private military company to push its geopolitical agenda everywhere. Ukraine, Syria, Mali, Central African Republic.
All while maintaining this facade, however thin it seems sometimes, of independence. Oh, they're just mercenaries, nothing to do with us officially.
It allowed Moscow to dodge direct responsibility for Wagner's actions, including some pretty horrific alleged war crimes, and avoid diplomatic blowback.
But that whole illusion of independence, that plausible deniability, it got blown up pretty spectacularly, didn't it, by Putin himself?
It did. On June 27, 2023, right after Prigozhin's failed mutiny, Putin went on television and basically laid it all out. The admission was surprisingly specific.
He gave numbers, right?
Exact figures. He stated publicly that the Russian state had fully funded Wagner. He said between May 2022 and May 2023 alone, the government spent 86.262 billion rubles, which is over $1 billion just on maintenance and incentive payments for Wagner fighters.
So you'd think, okay, game over for plausible deniability. How can you deny funding something when the president reads out the invoice on TV?
Logically, yes. But this is where the analysis gets interesting. The argument is that Putin's admission didn't actually eliminate the utility of Wagner as a gray zone tool. Instead, it shifted the mechanism. It moved from classic plausible deniability, which relies on secrecy, to something slightly different, but maybe even more insidious: strategic ambiguity.
Okay, explain that difference. Plausible deniability versus strategic ambiguity.
Plausible deniability works if people think your denial might actually be true. It needs a degree of secrecy, a lack of definitive proof connecting you to the action. Strategic ambiguity, on the other hand, is deliberate vagueness that can still work even when everyone basically knows you're lying, like with Wagner post-Putin's admission.
How does it still work then?
Its purpose shifts slightly. It's less about convincing people you're innocent and more about just muddying the waters enough to sow uncertainty, to delay international responses, think UN actions or coordinated sanctions, and just generally make it incredibly complicated for adversaries to decide how to react legally and politically.
So it's about creating paralysis through complexity, even when the facts seem clear.
Exactly. It shifts the burden. The question isn't, did Russia fund Wagner anymore? It becomes, okay, we know they did, but what exactly is the legal status now? How do we formally attribute these specific actions in Mali to the Russian state today? Can we sanction individual commanders without proof of direct orders from Moscow for this specific operation? It creates enough legal and political fog to slow down and complicate any decisive countermeasures. It's paralysis by ambiguity.
And this is where the U.S. policy debate, about designating Wagner as a foreign terrorist organization. FTO comes in
And
as a way to cut through that fog.
precisely. The FTO designation is seen by proponents as a powerful tool to pierce that strategic ambiguity.
What's the argument for designating them? Their motives seem primarily financial, not ideological like traditional terrorist groups.
That's true for the individual mercenary, perhaps. But the argument is that you have to look at the backer. Wagner's sponsor, the Russian state, clearly has explicit political motivations for deploying them. Expanding Russian influence, undermining U.S. and European security interests, accessing resources. So the argument goes, the group functions as a tool of state terror, even if individual motivations vary.
And what would an FTO designation actually do?
It imposes some serious consequences. First, it bans any U.S. persons or entities from providing material support or resources to Wagner. Second, it generally bars non-U.S. Wagner members from entering the United States. And third, it requires U.S. financial institutions to block any assets linked to the group.
So it really aims to isolate them financially and logistically.
Yes, but the real strategic value, according to the analysis, is the dilemma it forces directly onto Russia. It attacks the core benefit of using proxies, the cost-effectiveness and deniability. An FTO designation presents Moscow with two pretty unattractive options.
Option one being?
Option one. Russia could try to fully integrate the remaining Wagner forces, or their successor groups, directly into the official Russian military or intelligence structures. They've already done this with some units.
But the downside there is obvious.
Completely. If they become formal Russian military units, then Moscow loses any shred of ambiguity or deniability about their operations worldwide. Every action taken by those forces in Africa or elsewhere is unequivocally an act of the Russian state, carrying full political and legal accountability.
Okay, what's option two?
Option two. Russia could decide to just cut them loose. Leave the remaining Wagner-like structures to fend for themselves financially and logistically, basically severing the ties to avoid the FTO fallout hitting the state directly.
What's the risk there for Russia?
The risk is losing significant influence in key theaters like the Central African Republic or Mali, where these mercenary forces are currently the main, or sometimes only, effective security providers propping up regimes friendly to Moscow. It could also create instability, maybe even future mutinies, among these large groups of heavily armed, experienced fighters if they feel abandoned by the state that created them.
So the FTO designation essentially acts as a tool to force Russia's hand, to make them choose between openly owning their proxy activities or potentially losing the benefits of those activities.
Exactly. It's designed to eliminate the comfortable middle ground of strategic ambiguity that Wagner represented for so long. It forces a political cost back onto Russia for its gray zone operations. #tag out touch.
We've definitely covered a lot of ground today, really dug into the weeds of this gray zone competition. So just to try and pull the main threads together from this deep dive, what are the key takeaways?
Well, I think the first thing is understanding why Russia relies so heavily on these gray zone tactics. It's not just a preference, it's largely driven by economic necessity. It's their way of doing asymmetric balancing against a much wealthier West.
Right, the cost-effective path.
The second key takeaway is just how complex and multidimensional the threat really is. It's not just one thing. They target the very foundations of liberal societies, weaponizing everything from migration flows and property laws to, even religious institutions and historical narratives.
But then the third point, and this goes back to our surprising opening hook, the most effective defense seems to be emerging from within those targeted societies.
Exactly. That whole of society commitment, total defense, where resilience is built from the ground up, involving citizens, government, businesses, that seems to be where the West, particularly the Nordics and Baltics, are finding success. Combining that deep resilience with, when necessary, those decisive, albeit tricky, immediate military responses like QRA.
And that resilience, like we saw in Estonia, with over half the population willing to participate in defense, including minorities, that suggests Russia's hybrid tactics often aren't succeeding in their goal of breaking societal will.
Right. It suggests they might be miscalculating the political cost to themselves, that the pushback is stronger and more unified than they perhaps anticipated. That's where the West is winning idea comes from, perhaps. Winning the battle for societal cohesion, even while facing aggression.
But the fundamental dilemma remains incredibly difficult for democracies, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Because countering an enemy who deliberately weaponizes your own values, your commitment to asylum laws, to free speech, to property rights, it often forces you into these terrible choices.
Choices between upholding those core liberal values and ensuring immediate national security. It feels like a catch-22 sometimes.
It really does. Which brings us to the final thought we wanted to leave you with after this deep dive, something to mull over. When you're faced with an adversary who strategically forces you into that binary choice, security versus values, how do you ultimately measure success? Is success defined purely by whether you deterred the aggression, whether you maintained your physical borders and sovereignty?
Well,
Or is ultimate success measured by something else? Perhaps by the degree to which you managed to protect and uphold those foundational values that you were supposedly fighting to preserve in the first place, even under pressure?
right.
Which standard truly defines victory in this kind of conflict?